Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland, and I've been asked to make a video about liberalism because about a month ago, Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, he inveighed against liberalism, saying how it was so dreadful, and obviously that Russia's got a much better model. I'm not sure what to call it. It's illiberalism. It's sort of authoritarian, militaristic nationalism with a cult of the personality. But anyway, so when he was attacking liberalism, it wasn't in the narrow sense of the liberal ideology of certain liberal left parties in the United States and the Western world more generally. But it was more broadly freedom of expression, human rights and so forth. So the word liberal has only borne a political signification since around about 1800. This is obviously derived from the Latin word libertas, that's liberty. Although oddly it's closely related to the word for book, but then books and freedom are connected, and early liberals would certainly be against the freedom to print your ideas, because of course this is long before Marconi or Popov, if you prefer, invented the radio. So printing books and pamphlets or performing things on the stage was obviously crucial. So it's about civil liberty, originally liberalism. And if you live in an Occidental country, you may take some of these rights for granted, but these entitlements are, in some cases, quite new and really had to be struggled for. You could maybe think of Norman Rockwell's paintings. Norman Rockwell, this famous American artist after the Second World War, and he had a photo about the four freedoms, alluding to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's speech about the four freedoms: the freedom from want, the freedom of religion, freedom of speech. I can't even remember the last one, but freedom from want is a fascinating one, as in there shouldn't be privation. People should have the basics of life, to live in some dignity, enough to eat, a roof over your head, sufficient clothing, obviously heating, these days we'd say electricity, transport, maybe even a clean environment. And so freedom from and freedom to, this is the sort of division, the two types of freedom, as in, so we're allowed to do this, we're allowed to say what we want, go where we want, things like that. But are we guaranteed the minimum necessary to stay alive, and maybe not just the bare minimum, a little bit more than that, so we can live in reasonable comfort? Not saying everyone has to live in the lap of luxury, but we don't want people to suffer hardship unnecessarily, I don't think. Anyway, that gets into a more fascinating debate. So I don't think Roosevelt ever described himself as a liberal. He was a Democrat, one of the more liberal of the two American parties. But anyway, in the 18th century, these proto-liberals, I suppose to call them, were struggling for a constitution at all. Remember, certainly many European polities or Asiatic, African polities, so far as we know, were really despotic states where the potentate, well, he wielded really untrammeled power. So the people who went before that, well, Hobbes and some of the 17th century English political philosophers said that executive power needed to be tamed, power needed to be divided, separation of powers. Of course, when you come to the American Revolution, the intellectual origins of that go back, well, partly to 17th century Britain, but also to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, believing in preventing someone from being overmighty, questioning the divine right of kings. So these are what these proto-liberals were saying, the precursors to liberalism in the 18th century. They are part of the Enlightenment. And in France there were physiocrats and encyclopedists who believed they could simply amass as much knowledge as possible. That would in a sense emancipate them, and decisions could be taken on a more rational basis. And France was a very irrational place at the time in the way it was governed. So it had a highly sophisticated culture, yet an extraordinarily primitive governmental system that was Byzantine in its complexity and sclerotic. Take Voltaire, the celebrated French political philosopher of the time, Jean-Marie Arouet, as is almost never known. The only quotation from him that most people know is, "I completely disagree with you, but I defend to the death your right to say it." Now, as he said, écraser l'infâme, but there he was talking about the Catholic Church, which of course had so much power at the time. So he was saying, crush the infamous one. He really disliked it being such an obscurantist force and being so avaricious. So these precursors to liberalism, they opposed irrationalism, they promoted reason, and they didn't want people to be hidebound by tradition. They were striving against whalebone corseted conservatism, blind faith, hierarchy, a rigid class system, so we mustn't have these structured inequalities, the feudal system. So getting rid of that, la corvée, unpaid labour repairing roads, lettre de cachet, whereby by a mere signature the king could have someone locked up for life. That's what the people in La Bastille were suffering when they were liberated on the 14th of July 1789. So there were sort of pre-liberals in the British Isles at the time, the Whig party, wearing their buff and blue, but between them and the other party in that part of the world, the Tories, you wouldn't put a cigarette paper between them these days, and often we see rather abstruse and esoteric squabbles over religious denominations, over Anglicans, and who should be allowed this or that, and what tests should be applied to people to see whether they should be allowed to hold public office. Did they receive communion often enough? But in the 1790s, it was Charles James Fox publicly took an oath to our sovereign lord the people, which was scandalous at the time. So pre-liberals or Whigs, they weren't called pre-liberals, but I'm seeing them that way. Some are part of the Bowood Circle, going to Bowood House and walking through the gardens and seeing a line of statues, because Whigs, they viewed history as being an eternal battle. There was dualism, there was good versus evil, or as they would say it, liberty versus tyranny. So they wanted parliamentary government. Now they already had it in the United Kingdom, but greater control for the electorate element, less power for the crown, reducing its prerogatives, reducing its powers of patronage, and saying that we mustn't have votes for everyone because that'd be demagoguery. Then the benighted masses would rule. It would be the swinish multitude, as Edmund Burke would have said, because most people were illiterate. So we must give the vote to a few more people. And they're very cautious about that in the end of the 18th century, but certainly not most people. No women and not very many men. So there was sort of a millenarian view of history. There might become an almighty showdown between the two. Some sort of progress, but not too fast. Otherwise, it would things would be retrograde. You go back to barbarism and despotism, because some people might prefer to be ruled by a dictator. So liberals in the 19th century, they tended to want to have less government, get rid of censorship, maybe not entirely, because most countries still had laws against blasphemy and so on. They wanted freedom of the press, people to be able to perform what they want in theatre, not ban things on the grounds of outrage of public decency so much. There were some things which were still a no-no at the time. They tended to be sceptical of having an established religion, but almost everyone was religious at that time to some extent. They wished to end discrimination for the most part. They gradually came to be against racism, and the Vindication of the Rights of Women was published in the 1790s, and some of them began to think of having greater rights for women. That's really quite late on. It was John Stuart Mill in the 1860s was the first MP to say that women ought to be given the right to vote. It wasn't an entirely new idea. Been tried in France in the 1790s, or I won't go into it, but even in late medieval England, a few women were in Parliament, abbesses. So this is classical liberalism I'm really describing, and the nationalist movements in, say, Italy and Germany, Poland to some extent, and Ireland were small L liberal, pushing for the things I wanted as well as the unity and independence of their country. Or Italy from 1861 until 1922, that's known as liberal Italy, that epoch in Italian history. So also about spreading literacy and knowledge generally. But the classical liberals, mostly for the night watchman state, which is to say minimum government, the state should tax as little as possible, should not be as active, not very active, allow people to do what they wanted to, and certainly, say in the British Isles, not having a proper police force. Ireland, we had the Peace Preservation Force before we had the Royal Irish Constabulary. The Metropolitan Police was set up in London. That was considered to be an exception. Okay, there was various parish constables hired by local government, but they had very limited powers and very abysmally paid and no uniforms. But finally, Sir Robert Peel, though he's a Conservative, brought the police in. And the liberal aspect of British society said, oh, we can't do that because it's like a standing army without permission of Parliament. It could be used to bulldoze Parliament. This could be used to set up a dictatorship. We don't want this. This is the overweening power of the state poking its nose into our private affairs, bullying us and tyrannizing us. You can imagine what kind of power-happy little thug would want to join that just because he likes to push people around. So it's like Benjamin Franklin said, he who governs least governs best. I think it was he also said, if it doesn't pick my pocket or break my ankle, why should I care? So this is permissive liberty. You have the right to do anything you want unless it's specifically forbidden, and you can do whatever you want so long as you don't infringe on the rights of others. And a bit like in the United States, that wall of separation about, is it Danbury, Connecticut, between church and state, that one religious denomination couldn't impose their views on others or prohibit people from worshipping as they wanted. Remember, of course, in the United States, it was the federal government was forbidden to have established religions, not states. Some states did for the first few decades. So liberals tended to dislike compulsory military service and only introduce it when it was exigent. So they would say, in an emergency situation of wartime, they eventually bring it in. Like in the British Isles, we had the press gang pressing people on board into ships in the Royal Navy, giving them the king's shilling, sometimes the bottom of their glass. They didn't realise it was too late. But anyway, that was an abuse. It was got rid of in the early 19th century. So why have minimum government? Well, people don't want to pay tax. Or there was James Malthus who thought the same. That fellow of Jesus College, Cambridge, in the late 19th century, in his essay on population, saying a positive check with preventive check on population, as in late marriage, fewer children, or that's preventive check or positive check. Okay, women generally get married young, have lots of children, but loads of them die of malnutrition. We mustn't do that. We mustn't help the poor out too much. Must have indoor relief. Only be in the poorhouse. Anyway, you're going to get any succor, and then it's going to be dreadful, your plight there. So you only come in if you're absolutely desperate. You're not faking it. We mustn't be giving them handouts, otherwise they'll never work. They'll never stand on their own 2 feet, and just make the problem worse. We'll just, increase the number of paupers. So liberals tend to believe in masterly inactivity, but there wasn't a liberal party as such until the 1850s. So laissez-faire, laissez-passer, that was it. But then this obviously clashed with the Corn Laws, and the Anti-Corn Law League in the United Kingdom said, we mustn't have this ridiculous system whereby we're rigging the market, we're interfering to keep the price of corn artificially high, just to enrich the already affluent, these landowners. There are certain limits on what liberals are willing to do. As I say, very few of them, until the late 19th century, wanted to extend the rights of women. Almost everyone thought that homosexuality should be a crime. Indeed, in the United Kingdom, it was punishable by death. Much of what I would say would apply to liberals all over the world. Some liberals were still racist, and the odd thing is, from today's perspective, is they thought that the drug dealing was an innocent thing to do, even an honourable thing to do, making fortunes that way. Now, Gladstone, formerly Tory, later a Liberal, Gladstone was against this because his sister was an opium addict. And of course, selling opium for recreational use was entirely lawful in the United Kingdom, right up until the 1920s. So some liberals were free market fundamentalists. Others began to shift away from this. And the conservative paternalists, or those who said, no, we must be fatherly towards the lower orders, we must intervene and have laws to protect them. Oster and Sadler would be examples of this. And indeed, there'd be others like, who can I think of? Like the Earl of Shaftesbury, the poor man's Earl, introducing the 10 Hours Act, extending the franchise. So because they say there's no real choice, they're under duress. So some liberals eventually picked up on these ideas. That was classical liberalism, and liberals gradually, Whigs first of all, 1832, the first Representation of the People Act, giving the right to vote to more men, and again in 1867. But some people were unhappy with what Gladstone was wanting to do. These Adulamites went off to their cave of Adullam. It's a biblical allusion. And then finally in 1885, the Tories stealing a march of the Liberals and extending the vote to more people than the Liberals have proposed to do. Tory democracy, mostly bunkum, as Lord Randolph Churchill admitted, Father Winston Churchill. But anyway, the Liberals were in a sense running out of steam by the 1890s. The Tories dominated so much. But the Liberals tend to believe in human rights. Remember the rights of man, going back to the French Revolution, the tennis court oath, 1789, or they called it the rights of man, not human rights, but then homme can mean man, it can mean humans generally in French. But the new liberals around about 1900, Haldane and Hobhouse, they come up with ideas that they must intervene, they must help the poor. Remember, by about 1900, certainly in the British Isles, almost all men could vote, unless you're a sort of a journeyman or an itinerant labourer. You had the right to vote because you had to be in a constituency for over a year before you could vote. So socialism was growing, and the Liberals had to respond to that. The Labour Party was growing, and there was some Lib Lab pacts, Labour would hold one seat and the Liberals would hold another seat in a double-seated constituency, particularly in an urban industrial constituency. So had to respond to this. And the Tories had also done a few things for the working class under Disraeli and since. So more people were illiterate, more people were politically aware. And because of this growing political consciousness of the proletariat, the Liberals had to offer them more. And believing in self-governance in the colonies, and that's why the United Kingdom was willing to grant Dominion status, first of all, to Canada and Australia and so forth. So it wasn't just peace retrenchment reform, like Gladstone had said. Candle ends and cheese pairings, they certainly believed in austerity. I know Liberals are often castigated as faddists, a rainbow coalition of temperance activists who wanted to restrict alcohol sales. So that seems to clash with laissez-faire, and they're gradually moving away from that. And saying they're too into the Celtic fringe, home rule, particularly home rule for Ireland. The non-conformist conscience being moral, cracking down on prostitution and things like that. Well, people say the First World War killed off liberalism because this idea of human progress seemed to be daft, I suppose. And the Defence of the Realms Act, passed in 1914 under a Liberal government, was really the antithesis of liberalism, as in censoring the press, making it a crime to spread defeatism and despondency, right to sequester property and so forth. But then after the First World War, really there was class warfare, and Bolshevism was in the air. They didn't really take hold in the British Isles, and the Liberals obviously declined because they didn't represent an interest. They weren't class-based. So liberals are meant to be broad-minded, tolerant, cosmopolitan sort of people, and dislike hyper-nationalism, jingoism, chauvinism, militarism, things like that, and promote equality. But to some extent, liberalism's missions had been completed in terms of there had been some temperance legislation in the First World War, which some of which stayed, not banning alcohol, but severely restricting it. And the nonconformists were no longer discriminated against. There was the Church in Wales Act. And obviously, the Liberals in the UK were fatally split. I won't go into it. The parliamentary coup by Lloyd George against Asquith in December 1916. Lloyd George, a Liberal, becomes Prime Minister of a mostly Conservative government. But by the 1930s, the Liberals were split into three factions: Lloyd George Liberals, Samuelite Liberals, and Simonite Liberals, and really wrecked by the 1931 election, the national government. So that was sort of new liberalism in the early 20th century. You should read The Strange Death of Liberal England by George Dangerfield. But really, he's writing in 1935, but he's looking at the Edwardian period and just after, how the Liberals really declined just before the First World War. A lot of trades union militancy, strike action, and a recrudescence of Toryism, the Anglo-German naval race, and they just didn't seem to be able to address these issues. And Liberals are too restrained, too reasonable, and they don't really have such an emotional purchase, not tub thumping. They take too much of a considered view of things. So if it was voting with your class, are you bourgeois, you working class, that would obviously make you more likely to vote with one party or another, and if economic self-interest, and the Liberals didn't have enough to offer there. So they were earlier believers in internationalism and things like the League of Nations, later the European Union. And so much of what I'm saying would apply to Liberals, whether small L Liberals or capital L Liberals across the world. The Liberal Party in Australia is any party with the word Liberal in the name that really does well. There's a Progressive Liberal Party in the Bahamas, for instance, and they're often in government. So in the late 20th century, the Liberal left emerged, and Labour Party or Social Democratic parties, they often absorbed parts of liberalism. People became social liberals, promoting decriminalisation of homosexuality and obviously racial equality, and saying that immigration is to be welcomed and not feared. So this is the difficulty for liberalism. You believe in free market on workers, but then our public service will be under strain, and immigration is not always an entirely positive thing. And this is a contradiction amongst conservatism. If you're into capitalism, you should want a free market, including a free market for labour. So come one, come all. Drive down wages, but fine, that's what we want, the maximum profit. No minimum wage, and if you can't get a job, that's your problem. If the immigrant's willing to work for less or doing a better job, tough. But conservatism tends to favour nationalism over capitalism when it comes to the immigration issue. So freedom of expression has kind of gone the other way for liberalism. Remember Jeremy Thorpe, this waspish wag of a liberal leader, 1966 to 1977 for the UK Liberal Party. He spoke out against censorship, saying if we have censorship, we have to ban the Bible, because there's no book more full of violence and adultery than the Holy Bible. So liberalism has become politically correct in the last few decades and wanted more intervention. So things can be turned on its head. You can't say this, I can't say that. And often they're animated by the most laudable and most humane motives, and not wanting people to be bullied, insulted, not wanting the dissemination of racial hatred, which can lead to an incitement to violence. But they tend to then want the big state to monitor all this, and more welfare provision, more taxation, more governmental intervention to try and tackle poverty and people's problems. The old days would have been self-reliance. I think one of the fundamental shifts is that in the early 19th century, they're setting up labour exchanges and so on, and healthcare for children, and I can't think of old age pensions. That was new liberalism. Is also graduated taxation, a real litmus test. Gladstone been against it. Of course, it was all right for him because, by modern terms, he was a man who had hundreds of millions of pounds of inherited wealth. He didn't want progressive taxation. He wanted flat rate taxation. He even thought that income tax was a sort of a wartime measure people would never manage to phase out, paying off the national debt. So they tend to favour, must improve education, but that costs a lot of money. The Liberal Democrats out in the UK, the only party which often says, higher taxes, income taxes, whereas Labour won't say that usually, and care about for the environment. So they've gone from having less government to saying we should have more government. But they have taken a more pragmatic and, for lack of a better word, liberal approach to crime, looking at social causes rather than just bludgeoning criminals into submission and saying knuckle under. But on drugs, for example, they tend to favour decriminalisation, or on sexual activity, saying if it's legal to do it, it should be legal to show it. I remember Evan Harris saying that. So that's what liberalism is, I suppose, is about human rights, individual rights, tends towards libertarianism, not completely libertarian, and these are the things it likes and dislikes. So I'm a classical liberal, and that's what liberalism is. And I know sometimes it seems like a one-word oxymoron when it tries to ban things. And so I realise when it comes to, say, social justice warriors or some of the PC brigade, so-called liberalism can be a bad thing, and it's not true liberalism. So that, in a nutshell, is what liberalism is, and a whistle-stop history of liberalism with a strong prejudice towards Ireland and Great Britain.